Everything started on the wedding night, and when I got pregnant, at least I was 7 months gone, when he nearly stabbed me with a knife.
Therefore, this law cannot stand.
He pushed my aged mom down, threw the baby, now up to 2 weeks old. He threw the baby at her, and he pushed me back and slapped me.
We say 1 in 4 girls, by the time she reaches age 18, would have had one violent sexual encounter. And 70% of those girls would have had at least more than one. We're 160 million people, and 50% of us are women, and over 60% of us are under the age of 24. That's 10,000 girls every day. Somewhere in Nigeria, there's being abused.
A heavy patriarchal system is inherited from the West. British systems before were highly patriarchal. In fact, in Africa, we were more advanced in terms of power of women in leadership roles, women making decisions for the community and the society. Women had an organized system that existed in villages throughout Africa for centuries, and there were positions of power in every dynasty in Africa for women. Women were Iyaloja, Iyalode, whatever it is, mother of the king. They had rights, they had people weighed in on their own opinions.
In traditional societies, women had a pretty prominent role. Now the question is, well, how did this change? Well, in the post-colonial era, and obviously the colonial era we refer to is obviously the advent of the British, who were our colonial, I wouldn't like to use the word masters, but who had colonial control over what became Nigeria. And what I can certainly say is that you will find that the time that colonial influence was being exerted, was being enforced, was at the tail end of the Victorian era. Now, Victorian attitudes, Victorian values, Victorian mores were the guiding philosophy of the colonials.
When you bring in the colonial era, you need to remove and dissolve all systems of power that existed in order to have people serve the queen, right? So, it's hilarious because the queen herself was a woman, but the people doing the work were males. And they came without their wives. And so they were men walking around in control, and they empowered chiefs that were men. So in dissolving everything and starting again, they rebuilt a patriarchal system based on a system of chiefs that answered to colonel or whatever it is, and did not put back in place systems where women controlled.
It's easier for us to somehow deal with the complications and difficulties in life, I think, when there's some kind of order, when we can say, oh, but if you're a man, do ABC, if you're a woman, do XYZ. It helps us. We feel that those are the tools. And the way that we approach this as humanity is largely through mythos, through our mythology, which is almost synonymous with narrative in this instance. And so we use our cultural mythos to create ideas and say that, oh, this is what our ancestors did, this is what our culture says, this is what our tradition says.
Our traditions, to me, are the least influential, because actually they were better than where we are now. In Africa, the examples of societies where people take their mother's name, even in Nigeria.
There existed plural societies within what is today Nigeria in pre-colonial times. And the role of women differed between, obviously from society to societies. While some societies, women had a much more prominent position. One or two societies actually had lineal systems that were akin to the Ashanti matrilineal character. But one thing that was almost common to all societies, apart from maybe societies in northern Nigeria, was that women had significant control of the retail trade, of commerce. The markets were largely controlled by women, which is why, if you use the case study of the Omo or queens of Western Igbo land, the Omo or queen of Onitsha, Nwaboka, her story is actually quite interesting as a case study of female power within the pre-colonial context. She was a trader, not just a trader, she was an extremely wealthy trader. It is said that at the famous Otu Busi, she made £10,000 from one set of transactions. And we're talking about the 1880s. I mean, £10,000 today is probably something like about 200 to 250 million naira. So she made from one deal, she made £10,000. And this was a big deal for her. And with this, she bought the title of Omo. Obi Anazonwo, the Obi of Onitsha, granted her the title of Omo, and she became the queen of the women. She became one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, in the history of Onitsha. She exerted great influence over the women, but she was also a very strong individual. But then her control was largely over women and also over the markets, because that's this being, obviously, because by controlling women, you control the markets. The reality is that traditional societies that had strong, prominent female figures suffered decline as a result of British colonial influence in the Victorian, late Victorian and Edwardian era. Because certainly, I mean, British women had started murmuring about the right to vote. The suffragettes, they were still at least 20-something years from achieving their aim of having women vote, from this time. So, what we do find that the colonial influence definitely had an impact on the reduction of the influence, traditional influence of women in certain societies, in the same way that Islam had a reduction in the influence of women in northern Nigerian societies.
The North suffers from what I call the double whammy. Before we were colonized by the English, we were colonized by Arabs. We've had foreigners among us for much longer than parts of the South, funny enough. Although, when people talk about subjugation, and they tend to sort of focus on white people and colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. We had the Saharan slave trade, for example, in the North way before the white man came. Arabs were, selling black bodies and turning them into slaves, etc., etc.
In the North, there was the influence of Islam was in the same, also the same extent, was felt in the same way that the influence of European entry was felt in southern Nigeria. So we need to nuance this quite specifically.
And so a large chunk of our history is actually lost. What we call northern culture now predominantly tends to be Islamic culture. And so there's very little work, at least as far as I know, that has been done around societies that existed prior to the coming of Islam. And I mean, Islam has been in the North for thousands of years. So it's one of those really difficult things. We get glimpses from history of people like Amina of Zaria that there was indeed a time when women played political roles, played military roles, played leadership roles. The extent of that is not completely clear. Mostly, like I said, because a lot has happened. So it's one of those difficulties, but I can definitely tell you the traditional religion as currently structured in the North does not, in my view, and it's a controversial view, make it easy for women to take their rightful positions in society.
In northern Nigeria, it was slightly different because before the advent of Islam, a lot of what were known as pagan societies, women played a strong role in agriculture, in childbearing, and so on and so forth. They ran the homes, they also farmed. But with the advent of Islam, the woman's role was somewhat subjugated from its previous position in many societies, many northern societies. Once again, I have to nuance this with the comment that not all societies are the same. The fact of the matter is that the common thread to a lot of these societies was that once the Islam was introduced, there was a change in the social dynamic, thus that women, their role was a bit more rigorously regimented. But then you still had by accident of, by incident of lineage, you still had women playing a role in some examples. I mean, like Queen Amina, the legend of Queen Amina is a prime example. She was a strong feminine role model, but it was uncommon. And really her advent was as a result of lineage, as opposed to simply being merit-based that you'd have in a fluid society.
And also talking about the North, I think it is important that people understand that the North is not as homogeneous as people tend to sort of project it. So you have a north that is predominantly Muslim, but even within those Muslim cultures, you find little variations in terms of the way the religion has impacted on the people. And then you have a Christian north, which is, for some reason, that's the parts where most of the female farmers, for example, come from.
If you talk about women's revolts in Nigerian history, let's use some case studies. About women's war. It's not a riot, it's a war. And how did it start? After the British introduced, established the protectorates of southern and northern Nigeria in 1900, they started putting in place administrative structures. The methods of running this had been in north, and in western Nigeria, there was an easier infrastructure because there were established kingdoms, monarchies in western Nigeria and in northern Nigeria. They worked through the Obas and the Emirs to collect taxes and to administer their systems, their political systems. It didn't quite work in the east, so what they did, they started to appoint warrant chiefs. You come to a place like Oloko, suddenly, who have never had kings, and you tell them, okay, we've said that we're going to appoint somebody a king. And most of the people they appointed, these warrant chiefs, to these kingships, were people who were not very well respected in their communities, because there's a very, very strict system of progression, social progression, in Igbo society, for instance. Now, in Oloko, a chief was appointed, Okugo, who was not really a man that people respected, but they were like, okay, the British are now the new power. You've killed enough of our people, you've burnt enough of our villages for us to know that we can't really fight you back. So they accepted. Okay, fine, Okugo is the... Now, on one sunny day, Okugo sent his inspector, Mark Emeruwa, to the villages to go to the women's quarters and count and do what was clearly a tax assessment, counting sheep, goats, pots, and pans. And he went to the home of a lady called Wanyerowa, Oleka Okpo. And, she was there in front of her house processing palm fruit. And he was like, hey, woman, I'm here to count the goats and sheep in your, goats and chickens in your compound and pans. So her response to him was very simple. Did you count those of your mother before coming here? And obviously, he was the big man. He felt, how dare you? Because people were now being punished by the British might. Louts, nondescript, they never do well, were suddenly becoming men or people of stature because of the British influence. So suddenly, he was like, okay, I shall deal with you. And then, an altercation ensued, and she had been processing palm oil, and he was wearing a crisp white shirt. And, palm oil and white shirts don't go together. So she had, there was a bit of an... So he was like, okay, you're done for, you're finished. She was told, okay, you're in trouble. Just go and wind up all your affairs because basically you're dead. That's what she was told. Anyway, she gathered her, she reported to the women and says, look, to her women folk and said, look, this is there's a problem. And a meeting was called in the main Oloko town square, and they decided that they would fight back. The women were like, okay, you know what? We're fighting this. So they went to the palace of Okugo and were like, they raised hell. And then when some of the women had been injured in the altercation with Okugo, and then they were like, okay, you know what? Are we supposed to bow down? No, we're not. This is when the war starts. And then what started out as a small-sized revolt in a little village, Oloko is a village, now spread. It's because the women had held long-seated, deep-seated grievances, and how they now felt vent for those grievances. Social oppression, within the patriarchal environment that they lived in. It was almost like rage hard against the machine. Finally they had a chance to mobilize. It wasn't so much a question of them not having been vocal, but they now finally had a chance to mobilize themselves and fight back. The thing is, people thought women simply just accepted these things. But it was fine, you may have accepted because society had forced certain, but whether they were happy about it and whether they accepted it was a different thing altogether. Whether they were able to do something about it is one thing, but whether they were able to accept it, whether they accepted it is a different thing altogether. They didn't accept it, which is why that revolt was so powerful, because a lot of the deep-seated anger came out. Now, let's look at the Oyama miners' revolt of 1949, in which the miners at the Iva Valley at Enugu revolted against working conditions and also revolted against poor pay conditions, and this resulted in the death of several miners shot by the colonial police. Most people don't actually aware that the first impetus, the first revolt was actually led by the wives of the miners who challenged the poor treatment of their husbands. And then a third incident, which is many of which are, which these incidents are all, they're not separate, was the Abeokuta women's tax revolt, in which women led by the phenomenal, the incredible, the wonderful Funai Ransom Kuti revolted against the taxation regime introduced by the Alake of Abeokuta on behalf, once again, of the British colonial authorities. And this revolt was such that the women, peaceful but robust protest, they basically occupied, you're talking about occupy Nigeria, occupy London, occupy Wall Street. Occupation as a method of protest was not necessarily introduced by them, but has already been made legendary by the women of Abeokuta, in 1949. And in the 1940s, and they basically forced the Alake of Abeokuta, Alake Ademola, to abdicate, because really there was nowhere to go. And let's not forget that Funai Ransom Kuti visited the women, the Onyama, which went to Enugu after the Onyama mine incident, to show solidarity with the women who had in fact led the revolt. So all of these were intertwined. Funai Ransom Kuti herself was never hid the fact that she felt herself inspired by the women of Aba, or should I say of the Aba women, or the so-called Aba women's route, the women of Oloko. She was inspired by them because these women were simply phenomenal. But then all of these, as they say, all are a joined up process of women's protest and women's mobilization. And these things did not simply just emerge from nowhere. This culture of protest didn't emerge from nowhere. Women had always been able to protest whenever they felt pushed to the wall, whenever they felt that the society had taken a bend that required the women to stand up and make their presence felt. We're like, okay, women, we've given you men time to sort this out. You know what, now we're coming up and we're taking charge. Women will come up and protest. Women have had a say. But the thing is, their protests had always been nuanced and always been very well organized, but always been as something of a last resort. And what was common to these protests, none of these women were ready to die for the causes in which they believed in.
It was a bill to provide that a widow shall automatically become the guardian and custodian of her children. This law cannot stand.
Those in favor that the bill be read the second time say aye. Aye. Those against say nay. The nays have it.
I wasn't surprised that the Senate rejected the gender bill. You only need to look at our society and our culture to understand that for the majority of men, and even quite a sizable number of women, the idea of equality for women is just a no-no. This idea that we are full human beings that deserve the same rights, the same protection as men, is something that patriarchy, which is what we have in our communities, just does not recognize.
The gender equality bill was left to me, it is simply a lost battle. It is not a lost war. Because as I said, I take the long view. The legislators have come out and doused it. It is, oh, don't worry, the women will come back. I told you, women will always fight back.
The movement towards supporting women is global. It's a global movement. It's on the MDGs or the SDGs or whatever they call it now, but there is a global look towards empowering women. And you cannot deny that by placing women in leadership roles and engaging women in decision making, you then develop a nation. Nigeria is just going to have to come to that place of understanding that by excluding women in decision making, it's not going to work. I mean, the last 40 years is a good example, right? So I'm not sure. I really genuinely believe that if women had been engaged honestly, genuinely in decision making in the country, we would not be in as bad a situation as we are right now.
I think it's an unfortunate development. I come from a part of the country where, even though it's patrilineal, the power of women in my part of the country is extremely strong. In fact, it's dominant. The Shekri tribe are very strong women, extremely strong, and then people say, okay, the women domineering, they control, they do that. But I have no regrets for that position.
It was really a heartbreaking day for me, seeing on the screen the few men that voted for the gender equality bill, in sharp contrast with those who were against it. And even if one interrogates the whole bill, one will find out that it will go a long way in protecting our women, in changing the narrative.
The reality is that those who are afraid of gender equality are also afraid of so many things. So it's not just gender. Press freedom, information freedom bill, the census, anything that will bring about transparency. The political interest groups in this country have a phobia. They are scared of it because they do not know what the outcome will be.
There was perhaps a lack of coalescing around it, and that speaks more widely to an issue in Nigerian society that women's rights activists and thinkers and academics and grassroots organizations and so on and so forth are not really working together, which is not really a fault of theirs, in so much as it's an infrastructural problem as well in the country. But I think that if that were to have happened, there would have been a stronger chance if people were already aware that, okay, such and such a bill is going to be proposed. These are the things that are very likely going to stand in the way of it, i.e. tradition, religion, things like that. It's not enough for those of us that are involved in the feminist movement or the women's rights movement to just say that, these are the problems and this is the solution. We need, because the issues due to our history and colonial legacy, especially, is so complex. So we really need to be able to cater to each problem, each oppressive element on its own. And I think this is where the gender bill failed insofar that it, didn't get approved, and insofar as we can take any blame ourselves, because of course it didn't get approved because we live in a very sexist and patriarchal society.
So I think the trick is working on every level. If we're lucky, we'll get some leadership that will align itself with the global movement, but the truth of the matter is women's issues are going backwards all over the world. Look at it, it's not just in Africa. Look at what's happening in Asia. Look at what's happening in America.
That law will come back. It may not be in this. It may not be in the next the next few years. It may not be in the next decade. It may be, but it will come back. So I'm not even scared. It is the first step. And as you know, with advocacy, with the battle for women's rights, it was not something. You don't get discouraged by a feeble attempt at swatting away what is inevitable. So I'd say the women's movement is still, it's still work in progress, and long may that continue.
To be at risk means to face a possibility of harm, of danger, of loss. And Nigerian women, and I would like to also emphasize girls, face possibilities of harm, danger, and loss on a daily basis. So there's no question that we are at risk.
There is a lot of impunity going on. We see that women are being victimized workplace, home, families, and there is the need for women to be protected.
The oppression of women, of girls, actually starts the moment that a baby is born. In very many parts of this country, a family would be hoping for a male child, and so when they have a girl, that girl's right, human right to be valued and to be cherished is already taken away in very many cases. Even in situations where the girl is wanted, her rights from the very moment she's born are taken away insofar as the constitution and the legislation of this country operates, because she is not afforded the same rights from the very second that she's born as a boy in the bed next to her at the ward is.
I have been treated unfairly, most especially by my parents. If I say I want to be a lawyer, my daddy will come and say, no, you cannot be a lawyer. Lawyers are for men alone. And have you ever seen a female lawyer? And if you tell me yes, now you have seen it, tell you no, that I have not seen, that in his house we cannot be a lawyer.
And in the Nigerian mentality, I've noticed that they kind of see the boys as like they're bigger, they have more opportunities.
Because most of the time, women are always like neglected. Even in our government, everything they do in Nigeria is mostly the males that are ruling. Most of the occupations, the high-ranking offices, you see mostly male people. You don't see female. So that's how I felt, and women are mostly molested in this society. Always, you are hearing your story of rape by either father, brother, one person you trust the most. So I felt there are very, very great risks in the society.
Sometimes I feel in danger, maybe when I'm walking on a lonely street, or maybe I'm home alone, or maybe I'm in a quiet environment where I'm not with people that I'm familiar.
The difficult experiences I've had as a Nigerian girl is like at home. I'm like, I want to become this, like I want to become a lawyer and a presenter. They'll be like, how can you become this, that your brother, my brother, can become a better person. Like they think girls are like inferior, like the boys are superior to the girls.
In Nigeria, like there's a lot of discrimination. They do discriminate the women. They believe men can do better.
Young Nigerian women or girls like us, we are treated like education are not meant for us. They are meant for only the men, that is the boys alone. But it is not supposed to be so. It is education for all, both the male and the female, so that to impart knowledge on both the male and the female. Because they say when you train a man, you train a society, and when you train the female, you train a nation. So training us can bring out some hidden things in us, like the issue of the president stuff like that. A female can also be the president. There's nothing wrong with it, because in England, it is still a female that is still running the presidential system in their country.
Okay, the kind of future I want for myself and every other Nigerian girl is a bright future. A future where female Nigerians can have a say in anywhere you go to, both in the government house, in high places, all these offices, in big places. That kind of future I want. So where they will not be hearing stories of rape, molestation on the part of females.
The kind of future I want for my Nigerian women, I want Nigerian women to be great. Like, we should be seen than the way they see those men are like. I would love us to be like now they said the president are only meant for the male. I want a female, like in my own generation, I would love a female to be the president of Nigeria.
I feel that we girls, we should be given opportunity to I don't really know how to put it, but we should be given opportunity to do what we want to do. As in, we should be given chances to take whatever we want to do in life, or we should pursue our dream career, and we should not have obstacles.
Gender-based violence is a global problem. It's not a problem that we find only in Africa or in Nigeria.
There are women who have really suffered violence, and when people see them, they continue to pretend, oh, I fell down. A lot of these cases are not even reported.
When we talk about the statistics of rape and sexual violence in Nigeria today, we say 1 in 4 girls, by the time she reaches age 18, would have had one violent sexual encounter. And 70% of those girls would have had at least more than one. We're 160 million people, and 50% of us are women, and over 60% of us are under the age of 24. That's 10,000 girls every day. Somewhere in Nigeria, there's being abused. So how is it, why is it that we're not seeing more of these cases prosecuted? That's the question. Many of these women have no idea what their legal rights are.
Men have to change, essentially, because up till now, it has always been about women changing. Don't dress this way so that, you know, the man doesn't get aroused. No attempt has been made in our communities to have conversations with men about taking responsibility for their own, action.
For me, the narrative element is always so important. We need to weave these things together, because one way to transform these patterns is through mythos, through mythology, through narrative and storytelling. And I think that's a crucial thing. And it is happening, you know, with the advent, perhaps in modern times, we can look at, you know, feminism and women's rights and how much that is changing the mythology that we have as a people.
Fortunately, the world is changing. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I certainly know that women, young girls are growing up determined to take their place in the world. And in that sense, the train has left the station. And so men that don't change will suffer. There's an inevitability about the change that is coming, but we certainly have to do our bit as well. And I think educating women, particularly, is a very important way of doing this.
Whether we like it or not, Nigeria is part of the global society. If 55% of the population in the world are women, the women are getting better educated, they are being liberated, there's liberal thinking, there's consensus on many things, right? It's only a question of time. These things are going to fall by the wayside. We are coming to a society where everybody has to account for himself. And it's going to be a more competitive society. And if the best resources, talent, reside in a woman, so be it.
Nigerian women, young women are on social media. They are reading things, they are learning outside of traditional institutions, which are not offering too much. And that's part of what affects also women's rights, is not knowing our history. Young people don't know the history of Nigeria. They don't know about the great women in Nigeria. They don't know about the traditions that existed before now. There's just this massive vacuum, and then they just know about now.
If you sit a diaspora Nigerian down in a bar in London and ask him, so how do you think women were treated in Africa pre-colonial times? They'd be like, oh, they were just locked up, they were just like slaves and stuff, which really is what they would say without knowing that that's a totally wrong narrative. And when you are engaged, because that's due to lack of knowledge, I wouldn't blame someone for saying that, due to lack of knowledge, and I might even be generalizing. But then, when knowledge enables you to think, well, hang on, this wasn't quite like this. This is who we are. This is who we were. And that engagement is part of the process of taking responsibility. Because then when you remember who you are, then you can now start to think of, okay, how can I rebuild myself? Because a lot of the time, the blame game is what, as you alluded to, well, colonialism, slavery and colonialism made us the way we are. It gets to a point where with education, and not just Western education, well, with education, as enlightenment as to what your universe really is, there's a time to it's time to take responsibility and stop blaming somebody else. Blame, yes, let us blame. Let us blame because slavery, definitely people deserve to be blamed for slavery. It was an inhumane trade which certainly caused massive dislocation in African society, not just Nigerian society. We must blame. But at the same time as you're blaming, you're rebuilding.
The truth is that whatever future we want is possible, but it has to be built. It has to be nurtured. I'd like to think that education is key. And for Nigeria, not just our women, actually, because we are in dire straits in this country, for us to actually begin to just build back and even get back to where we were maybe 20, 30 years ago, we can't do it without overhauling our education system, because it's all about the mind and the thinking.
We need to reflect as a society. We also need to ask ourselves, what are those things that were authentically African, authentically Nigerian, authentically Igbo, authentically Yoruba, authentically Efik, that worked? And where are the ones that came from somewhere else that's not working? Until we're ready to be introspective, until we're ready to ask the hard questions, to be academic, until our institutions are ready to function for this time and not for the time when the British were looking for civil servants or factory workers. Until we're ready to model ourselves after ourselves, that is when things will begin to make sense.
Nigerian women never took what was given to them. That is a myth we have to dispel. Nigerian women never took what was given to them. Nigerian women always fought back.
I'm not worried about what I'm seeing, because when things are bad is when people take up the cause.